Hideki Tojo, The Quest for Greater Asia. In the battle for dominance over the global arena, nations strive to gain as much power to stand above all the rest. A nation from the periphery, in its quest for greatness, can only take so much from the hegemony of the dominant powers. In 1850, when the dominant world powers such as the United States and Britain advanced their colonial interests, Japan, which was then a feudal and economically backward society, was forced to bow to such powers. It was only a matter of time before its leaders realized that it was time for Japan to keep up with the competition. Along with the modernization of the country, the ideology of a Greater Asia then filled the minds of the Japanese, and the leaders were willing to go to great lengths to unite all of Asia and make it into one political and economic unit under its subjugation, no matter how violent the means may be. It was under this context that Hideki Tojo, a soldier, statesman, and Japan's former prime minister, upheld this ideology and made a decisive act that forever marked history. Hideki Tojo was born in Tokyo on December 30th, 1884. Early on in his childhood, apart from the apparent influence of his lieutenant general father, Tojo's mindset was already shaped by Japan's Meiji educational system of his time. His career as a soldier was already set, just as the careers of all the Japanese boys of his age were. As part of Emperor Meiji's plan of modernizing Japan's military, the concept of war as a noble pursuit was instilled in the young boys' minds. Although branded as intellectually average, Tojo was competitive and had an extreme work ethic that later on in his life, his only known hobby was his work.
建国2600年、我らは未だかつて戦いに敗れたことを知りません。この自責の解雇こそ、いかなる強敵をも支えするの確信を生ずるものであります。
After graduating from the Imperial Military Academy and the Military Staff College, Tojo started his career as a military attaché in the Japanese embassy in Berlin after the First World War. There, he earned his reputation as a strict and diligent administrator and was even nicknamed Kamisori, which means razor, for his strict personality. Tojo began to have an interest in militarist politics when he commanded an infantry regiment in the Army Ministry for 3 years. In 1934, he became the Major General of the General Staff and commanded the 34th Infantry Brigade. In 1935, he became the commander of the largest army group in Japan, the Kwantung Army. Tojo further rose in the ranks in 1937 when he became the Chief of Staff of the same army.
Shanghai has fallen to Japan. For the final terrific onslaught of Japan's mechanized army, China is forced to withdraw beyond the Suchao Creek, and Japan's army commander controls all the native sections of the world's 6th largest city. These pictures show the final street-to-street and hand-to-hand battle, the house-to-house advance behind a smoke screen, with tanks snorting ahead through the narrow streets. The wounded carried away under a withering hail of machine gun bullets, bombs falling from the air like raindrops in an April shower. Watch close and you can actually see the bombs twisting down. With British and French troops watching but not allowed to interfere, these 45 square miles become the world's storm center, where one stray bullet, one misdirected bomb might bring death to a British subject.
When Japan invaded China that year, Tojo arrived at a realization that the only way to make China cooperate and end Western imperialism was an overwhelming show of force. He certainly brought this perspective with him in the crucial decisions he made later on. He entered the cabinet of Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro when the former appointed him as the Minister of War in July 1940. His influence pushed for Japan's signing of the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940. In 1941, he prompted the cabinet to invade the southern parts of Indochina. He also proposed invading the British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, despite the prospect of war with the United States, as well as the latter's oil embargo against Japan, which was certainly an economic problem. Konoe wanted to opt for diplomatic means to address this and was not at all in favor of a prospective war, despite his cabinet members such as Tojo yearning for it. He tried to communicate with the American Secretary of State Cordell Hull to get a summit for an agreement. Hull's condition to lift the oil embargo, however, stipulated in the Hull Note, was Japan giving up its military clutches on Indochina and China. However, Tojo framed the note as a complete disadvantage to Japan. Konoe eventually resigned as prime minister in October 1941, and Tojo was appointed by Emperor Hirohito to succeed him. Perhaps for Tojo, the hindrance was finally gone, and the war was sure to come. On December 8th, Japan attacked Malaya, Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Guam, and the notorious U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which was attacked on December 7th due to the different time zone. Japan successfully subjugated most of Asia, and it seemed like its dream of a greater Asia was already coming true. Although this dream may have been short-lived, having its full bloom only in 1942 and abrupt end in 1945, it stretches way back to Japan's occupation of Taiwan in 1895. From there, Japan made its way to successfully annex Korea and control its finances and foreign policy in 1910, then leased the Liaotung Peninsula in 1905 for 90 years through a treaty, and then infiltrated and established puppet governments in central China in the 1930s. Although it successfully occupied the above-mentioned Southeast Asian nations in 1941, governing such a wide stretch of territories was a challenge for Japan, especially in terms of winning the occupied people's loyalty. This is aside from the fact that the US retaliated and made obvious gains. Tojo attempted to shy the world away from the news of enemy gains and save his reputation by sending the leaders of the occupied territories to Tokyo in 1943 for the Great Asian Conference, a supposedly symbolic high point for the Greater Asia. Yet, ironically, despite its main goal to finally be free from Western imperialism, the language used in the conference was English, which was an obvious limitation. This only shows that Japan cannot keep up and stand firm with its ambitious goals. The government of Tojo collapsed when Saipan fell to the US Army and Marines. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings finally urged Japan to surrender on September 2, 1945. It was not clear whether it was due to his failure as prime minister, the unfulfilled Japanese dream, or the overall shame for everything he orchestrated. Tojo shot himself with a .38 caliber pistol. Yet, even his suicide attempt was a fail. He was saved by an American doctor by giving him a blood transfusion. However, his regained life would not last that long, for he was eventually executed on December 23, 1948, due to being convicted of war crimes. Was Hideki Tojo only a victim of the Japanese indoctrination of his time? Or was he a leader of his agency who opted for violence over diplomacy? Perhaps he was both. Although he was not alone in the horrors that Japan caused in its attempt to be a global hegemon, it certainly did not save him from being accountable for his actions. Indeed, he paid the price towards the end of his life. No matter how grave injustice Western imperialism was, it does not validate another violent imperialist attempt. The decisions and the fate of Hideki Tojo are a reminder to the Japanese, and perhaps to the whole world, that violence is never the solution to everything. Thank you for joining us today in exploring Hideki Tojo's story. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can join me again next time as we look into the life of other historical figures that shaped the world as we know it.